Hi, my name's Ryan Evans. I'm the editor-in-chief of War on the Rocks and the publisher of the Texas National Security Review. In our last episode, we featured a speech by Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence. At that very same conference, organized by the Intelligence Studies Project, a collaborative effort of the Strauss and Clements Centers down at the University of Texas, there was a fascinating conversation moderated by Michele Malvesti of Tufts University that featured John McLaughlin, the former acting director of Central Intelligence, Nicholas Rasmussen, former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and Norman Roule, the former National Intelligence Manager for Iran. Enjoy.
I want to spend a little bit of time baselining on what we mean about competence. So the title of our panel is competence. And Steve Slick gave us a little bit of gut. We are in favor of competence. I think if I have to give the bottom line up front, we could probably say that we'll agree that it's good and it's necessary. But Steve gave us a little bit of some guidance on this. Essentially it's focusing on competence and the questions that the intelligence community cannot afford to get wrong. I'd like to expand upon that a little bit and look at competence along at least three vectors. Competence in the intelligence community in terms of providing long-term foundational expertise and knowledge, competence in preventing strategic surprise, and finally, competence in terms of assisting and supporting the national security decision-making process. This gets back to what John had said, asked a question in the first panel, and noted that one of the key elements of intelligence is to give decision makers a decision advantage. And I think we'll explore that as we continue on with the panel. In terms of ensuring competence, or effectively making sure that we get the questions right, we also get the answers right, is underlying that is the importance of making sure that our intelligence community leaders who operate in a resource-constrained environment are making the right choices and the hard choices on priority issues. Priorities in terms of investments in technologies, the right priorities in investments on collection disciplines and organizational structures, as well as intellectual and human capital. And so all of those elements will certainly come together as we discuss competence. I'd like to pose the first question. I'm going to pose it first to John, but I think it's important to pivot off of the last question I think that was asked from the conversation with Director Coates, but providing a little historical perspective. Let's get a little bit of a historical sweep in terms of the intelligence challenges that the IC faces today. In what ways are they, if they are, qualitatively different from what the intelligence community may have faced in previous eras, previous decades, and also lessons learned from ensuring or in developing competence during those time periods to be able to address those challenges. And so we'll start with you, Director.
Well, we could approach that in a dozen different ways, and we just talked about it a moment ago, and I think the way I would approach it, for starters, would be to look at it in terms of chronology, just to do it that way. Now, I was not in World War II. All right, let's make that clear right up front.
Too old for the draft?
Yeah, too old for the draft, yeah. But, I tend to think of that issue in a chronological way, actually going back to World War II. The emergence of a national intelligence effort in the United States coincided with the fact that World War II ended, and the experience of it itself drove home for the United States that it had global responsibilities. We didn't really feel that way uniformly before World War II. I'm reading a biography of FDR now. Look at the 30s. We didn't feel that way. After World War II, the CIA is created, and we then face, let's say, 45, 46 years of what was the Cold War. And that was a challenge where we had to deal with a range of existential issues and in a global struggle that involved ideology, technology, and everything else. And we won, basically. that rival went away. And so in 1991, when the Soviet Union falls, the intelligence challenge changes pretty dramatically. But at the same time, and the reason I'm doing it this way is because intelligence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It only exists to help the decision maker with decision advantage. If you are not actually supporting our policymakers as they try and navigate in a difficult world, there's no point in doing this. So you go into that period after the end of the Cold War, and we really have pretty much, as a nation, a kind of free path for about 17 years. We are the superpower without interruption until, I would say, 2008 and the financial crisis. When the world starts to change and when our model is doubted somewhat, and when powers that were not particularly powerful when the Soviet Union collapsed have risen. The Soviet Union is gone, but Russia is back. China is rising. And from 2008 forward to today, we face a much more complex world as a country in foreign policy. So the challenges for intelligence after World War II, get organized and figure out what your job is and combat the Soviet Union. And then the challenges are to help basically a superpower make its way in the world. And now we're in a much more competitive environment in which we need foundational intelligence, we need agility, we need expertise. One other way to think about this is to compare it with the Cold War. Okay, let's just say Cold War and now. Cold War, we could organize ourselves by looking through the Soviet prism. And if you're interested in Latin America, it was probably because you were trying to checkmate the Soviet Union there. Africa, the same way. Today, that's gone. We have to be interested in all of those places for what they are in and of themselves, down to the municipal level often, in great granular detail. Cold War, we had to look for really big things in the world. Deployed nuclear forces, bombers, submarines, motorized rifle division on the German border. You still have to look for all that, but now you have to look for real little things too. You know, a bomb in a suitcase, one individual in a city of 17 million, a single packet of data moving through the global information network, little things. Okay? Secrets. Cold War, they were mostly held by a small group of people, and you could meet some of them at cocktail parties. Today, not so much. Secrets you want are probably buried somewhere in Syria or on the Afghan-Pak border or deep inside the Soviet or the Russian, the Chinese Politburo. And sharing, back then we didn't have to share very much, but today you have to share this information from the local law enforcement level all the way up to the senior strategic level. So the challenge for intelligence today is dramatically different than it was when we were created, and more complex and more granular. That's how I would think about it.
Thank you for that, John. Let's expand upon this. And I'm going to turn right now to Norm. The challenges today are dramatically different across an array of issues that John just outlined. We're living in a world, for example, where there are simultaneously so many regions that are unstable, with the potential to lead to the outbreak of war. What level of effort should the intelligence community be trying to dedicate in terms of identifying the next hotspot, in terms of predicting the next Arab Spring, the next outbreak that amplifies the type of diverse challenges that John just laid out?
Well, I think it's very difficult to design an architecture which predicts an Arab Spring precisely. If you were to say, identify the list of those conditions in the Middle East which existed prior to the Arab Spring, you would find that most exist today. The unrest that took place in Iran and the conditions behind that earlier this year was identical to the unrest and the conditions that took place in Tunisia simultaneously. And you have protests routinely where vegetable salesmen have been killed, but it hasn't produced that change. At the same time, you have dramatic conflicts which don't receive a lot of attention. The Congo, for example. You have a vast nation, very mineral rich, with 8 or 9 neighbors that are biting pieces of it away, and several million people have been consumed in that tragedy. It's easy to say that Venezuela is facing an economic collapse, but will that produce the type of anarchy that becomes regional? It's difficult to say. Crowd intent is always very hard. What the IC should do, can do, and actually does a pretty good job in doing is to say, these conditions exist, this could happen, and if it did, you would have these sorts of choices.
Okay, so let's take that another step further when you're dealing with perhaps allocation of resources and priorities. I'm going to turn first to Nick, but then I'd like to pivot back to both John and Norm on this. So we understand the challenges in terms of predictive intelligence. Throughout most of the post 9/11 period, though, one of the primary intelligence resources were focused on terrorism, on combating terrorism, and the resources were abundant. And certainly during that period, virtually no other national security issue rose to the particular level of, in terms of the threat issue and the importance of preventing strategic surprise in that domain. Arguably, this is no longer true. We just heard from D.N.I. Coates. You heard him describe the challenges of cyber. You heard him describe the challenges of North Korea and the nuclear threat. Some now, when you look back at the counterterrorism mission, might argue that we're overinvested, might argue even that we're over-resourced on CT. How does the CT community perhaps deal with shifts in resourcing and the importance of still preventing strategic surprise in this domain, Nick?
Well, and this is something that I was worrying about, kind of starting to worry about every day as I left government service, because this has been a train that has been, you could see coming in the distance for quite some time now. Just what Steve and Director Coates talked about, the idea that for the last 4, 5, 6 years, cyber and other issues have accompanied terrorism in that first couple of paragraphs of the D&I's annual threat testimony, lifting those issues up as they should be lifted up. Even someone in a parochial counterterrorism or terrorism-related position like myself could not argue that those issues weren't pressing their way onto the agenda and should be pressing their way onto the agenda. What has not happened thus far, though, is that it hasn't yet, in my mind, resulted in a pull of resources away from the counterterrorism problem set. That's coming, in my mind, because we just don't have enough blanket to cover all 4 corners of the bed. If you're talking about overhead architecture to do the kind of overhead collection we do globally, if you're talking about training young analysts to be smart on various topic areas, pick whatever metric that you use to measure IC investment in resources. And the fact is we are having to do more, to cover more, to be aware of more, to prevent strategic surprise across more different vectors than we were just a few years ago. And again, I think we've made enough progress in the fight against global terrorism that I don't mind sharing that center stage with those other issues, because we should. But I worry that over time, if we shift investment away from some of the terrorism discipline, counterterrorism discipline, and underinvest in that, we could find ourselves again facing strategic surprise. It's easy for me to say that. I can't point to when, where, how, where that spot in the world is that problem might emanate from. But it is something that I think our counterterrorism community is going to have to learn how to do, which is to do more with less. And it's not something they've had to do in the period since 9/11, when you could pretty much count on, as Michele said, the abundancy of resources.
Yeah, can I add to that?
Please.
Because I think this is one of the most difficult and important things you do in the intelligence world. Even though there's a myth that American intelligence can cover everything at all times, and we encourage that myth, it's also true that you have to make choices all the time, and you can't do everything all the time. So it was not uncommon when I was in my last job to pick up the phone and call the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for example, and say, I really need you to move a destroyer from the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. And in my mind, I'm thinking I'm going to possibly miss that missile launch in the Indian Ocean, but I need that collection in the Persian Gulf a little bit more. In other words, you're making a decision that is consciously recognizing that you may fail somewhere in order to succeed somewhere else. And this happens all the time in this business. So you have to constantly be thinking and talk about things the public doesn't understand. That never arises when there's a question of an intelligence failure. So we were accused of having failed to detect the Indian nuclear test in 1998. There's a whole story behind that. But one of the things to realize is that we had actually moved some resources once again to the Persian Gulf rather than the Indian Ocean area. So that happens. So what criteria do you use? Well, I go back to something. I used to take notes when Bob Gates talked, generally. I found that was a good strategy. And I remember on one occasion, he drew concentric circles and said, here's how I do it. I put the most important issues in the innermost circle, and then I draw circles out and say, these are important but less. Maybe you can think of them as urgent, important, emerging, and maintenance. Okay? Does that make sense? So urgent, what's urgent? Well, things that threaten the lives of Americans or the physical security of our country or our troops in battle. Okay? You got to get those things right. So what's that list? It's sometimes counterterrorism. It's sometimes weapon systems. It's nuclear. It's cyber. So that list's getting longer. And then, to me, the second big circle is big places about which we are not certain that could go bad on us and haven't yet, maybe. Okay, so China's there. You need I don't know whether China's going to be a competitor, adversary, or what. Certainly going to be a competitor. But intelligence needs to have a riveting focus on China. And Russia now, of course, is in that category as well with greater certainty. So one could go on in this way. But the point is, you need to be conscious about your choice of priorities. And then you also have to be flexible because they change often. And so you've got to be able to move things around very quickly.
And this is why the ODNI is critical, because that certainly was the way the world did and should have worked at that time. That's not how the world should work right now. You need to have one place where you have someone who has an exquisite understanding of your GeoInt, your SIGINT, your HUMINT, et cetera, who's got that focal point with the president. That's the DCIA. That's great. But if it's the DNI, then the DNI's got to make that call. Where you run into a problem is that, let's take the issue of cyber. So the countries that have attacked the United States or ostensibly been involved in attacks in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. You have China, you have Russia, you have Iran, you have North Korea. In order to set up, and maybe others, in order to work that, you need to have 4 or 5 different programs with country-specific specialists. And these people have to be developed and grown. This isn't something you turn on overnight. You can indeed move, as John correctly stated, certain assets quickly. And there's a cost. The second issue we have is when we're at war, that comes at the cost of a lot of intelligence collection in 2 ways. There's no colonel in the world who's defending his forces that can't get enough imagery of his perimeter. If you can get 10 shots a day, you should push for 20. But what really changes? Maybe unsure. But who wants to tell that colonel who's keeping America's treasure safe he can't have 2 or 3 more imagery shots? Well, that comes at the cost of something nearby. And that's a real story. The final comment I would make is when you're thinking about resources and investments, conflicts develop generations of people. It's actually relatively easier to take people who've done counterterrorism, targeters, relational database, thinkers, et cetera, and move them to similar type of topics. Counterintelligence is actually quite close. But if you've spent 2 to 3 tours in a war zone, doing war zone type of issues, which is critical, important, and saves the lives of our soldiers, our soldiers, and et cetera, that's a lot harder to transform into strategic collection issues. So you actually, by building up these programs, you have to figure out how you transform these people. In some cases, you may note, there are a lot of people who joined the IC at 9/11 and left after about 10 years. And they often spent a lot of their time doing heroic actions in war zones, but it's just not their cup of tea to penetrate the Kremlin, to penetrate the Supreme Leader's office, to penetrate Kim Jong-un's office, et cetera, et cetera. No harm, no foul here. So resource development has a long-term tail, and when you make decisions on what to do with policy, you're going to feel it.
So I'm gonna pose I'm gonna pivot off the issue. You raised two issues that are sticking out to me right now, Norm. You raised an issue, of course, organizational structures as a key component for helping to develop competence. You talk about the importance of the D&I. You also talk about the importance of intellectual and human capital in terms of focusing talent priorities on specific areas. I'm curious if I'm going to link, the issues of, let's say, the importance of preventing strategic surprise and also the importance of developing foundational knowledge over time. Two issues are kind of popping to mind. One is North Korea as a hard target. And in terms of being able to develop the intellectual and human capital, to develop that long-term foundational knowledge on what is arguably one of our hardest intelligence targets. And perhaps juxtapose that with the importance of preventing strategic surprise out of a post-conflict Syria, for example. How would that compare for the intelligence community enterprise being able to organize itself to meet those challenges?
Syria is the most complex problem we're facing as a nation right now. All of the problems of the Middle East converge in Syria, and all of the implications of Syria are global. Everything. Why did Brexit occur in the UK? And how did that then impact on the unity of the EU? Probably because of migration from Syria. That isn't true. It's what they thought, though. When I say it's not true, but just that was the impression that was let loose in that referendum. And our leadership in the world will be judged somewhat by our performance in Syria, because at present, the Russians, I think, this is not intelligence, I'm talking more as a foreign policy analyst, the Russians at this point are probably the most influential actor in Syria, along with the Iranians. And we are playing a very small role in the diplomacy. We have a military role working with the Kurds. We've got a little corner of Syria that we have. But a lot will be, the implications of Syria going forward will be enormous. And so intelligence needs to be very focused on telling the policymaker what are the implications long-term from Syria. We could talk more about that. North Korea, you're right. North Korea illustrates the classic dilemma in intelligence as we struggle between understanding of capabilities and intent. We pretty much understand capabilities in North Korea now. Most of it, I'm just looking at open source, okay? I'm not looking at any classified data, but on the basis of open source, I can say with some confidence that the payload they can lift now with their ICBM test vehicle is about 1,000 kilograms, and you only need about 700 kilograms to push up a nuclear weapon. So that's just based on what I read from scientists who are looking at imagery. So intent is harder in North Korea, as it is almost everywhere. And this cuts across, we talk about the challenges, this cuts across so many ways, because today you talked about foundational intelligence. Frankly, I think foundational intelligence, meaning by foundational intelligence, I think we mean, what is this country? Who's there? What are the cultural and tribal and sectoral issues there and so forth? That's all pretty easy today. You have the CIA World Fact Book, for God's sake. But you also just, if your homepage is Real Clear World, there's someone writing about all these things every day, or if it's War on the Rocks. Foundational is pretty easy. I recently did a little study of, you're going to think I'm obsessed with World War II, a little study of intelligence in World War II. And one of the principal intelligence officers of that era said, Europe was pretty easy foundationally because we all knew about Europe. No one knew anything about Bataan, Papua New Guinea, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima. There was no foundational intelligence at all. When our troops invaded North Africa, this is the first analytic job that the OSS did was, what's the beach like? Who lives there? What do they speak? Okay, we know all of that today. So the foundational issue is much easier because we're living in this information era. My phone's in my pocket. There's my foundational intelligence. Well, but intent is as elusive as it ever was. And what this has done is narrow, Steve Aftergood's still here, he might agree with me. It's narrowed the range of things that are really important for the United States to get with its intelligence. And all those things now are harder. The Chinese Politburo doesn't do SIGINT. They have a fleet of trucks to drive around their debates on paper. So who do you want to recruit? Truck driver? Maybe. It's all much harder than it used to be when you're talking about intent in some of these places like North Korea, China, Russia. So that's, I think, where the real crunch is coming in our enterprise.
Thank
Michele,
you for that. You
follow
wanted
up a little bit on the foundational intelligence question, because kind of good news, bad news. We're describing a world in which we've got to have foundational intelligence on almost every topic, because almost every region, topic, or conflict zone could produce the surprise event that puts our national security interests at risk. On the other hand, so we in the IC are pretty good at describing how deep the hole is that we live in and why we need more resources to dig our way out of it. But I think what John pointed out is something worth remembering. A lot of that foundational intelligence exists in the open source world right now, and we need not, in my view, spend a whole lot of time investing in capability in that on behalf of the intelligence community. I kind of used to joke when I would read my PDB, I'd see once a year an article, usually timed to the visit of some head of state or something, about the performance of the Slovak economy or the performance of the oil sector in Hungary. Hungary doesn't even have an oil sector. And that told me there's probably an analyst whose job it is to monitor, track, watch, know, live that topic area. And yet, as John pointed out, your iPhone can tell you much, if not most, of what you need to know about issues like that are not necessarily at the crux of our national security set of challenges and dilemmas. So how do you shift the resources away from that to put them on the critical topics where we do have not only comparative advantage, but necessarily some exclusivity in terms of whether the government should be doing this work? And I worry a little bit that we remain a little spread too thinly across the intelligence community enterprise, covering things that are not quite first or second or third tier in terms of their potential existential impact.
I think we do both. We have, to understanding intent, you need to understand decision-making architecture. Unless you have that microphone in right next to President Putin that carries around all day, et cetera, et cetera. Have I said too much? Sorry, you're all and everybody else watching this. We've got to take you all out.
He's just dreaming.
He's dreaming, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm just dreaming. What a dream.
Fantasizing.
What a dream. What a dream. Okay,
but I couldn't possibly comment.
Exactly. But understanding those layers which change and the people around them that move around give you a sense of how information flows to people. So you've heard the White House say that Kim Jong-un may not be receiving appropriate information about the true nature of the horror that is the North Korean economy, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps. But in any case, that tells you something about his structure. And if you understand that structure, you understand the information that's flowing up on certain issues, you can predict how your adversary may respond on certain points, particularly if you've studied him so long and you know the fellow and his clan so well that you see how they behave in similar instances. So there's a case here for subject matter expertise. There's a case here for long-term investment on hard issues. There's a case for, as Nick wisely stated, of making sure that we have not risked that by understanding information that you can pick up somewhere else. And at this other point, I'd like to talk about Open Source Center. But
yeah, I'm going to actually, that's the next question. I understand the importance of where you are on intentions. Policymakers place a very, very high premium on enemy intentions, adversary intentions. So it's an important thematic. But each of you were talking about sources of information. And so I'd like to pivot a little bit to that and where the intelligence community needs to strike the right balance between traditional sources of intelligence, human, imagery, SIGINT, versus publicly available information, open source information. And I'd like first to go to Nick and then to Norm in terms of how the sources of intelligence have changed, Nick, in terms of counterterrorism mission. I'll turn then to Norm in terms of when you're making judgments on Iran, where were you looking for sources of information, how that has evolved over time. But Nick, if you could address the CT component.
I'd say there's been a pretty dramatic evolution over the last half decade in the counterterrorism world in that we've had to expand our horizons to look at sources of information and intelligence that go well beyond what Michele described as those traditional sources. I hate to make it sound like in the good old days when all we had to do was worry about Al-Qaeda and getting their email. But there was a period of time where you could, in a sense, spend enormous time and effort trying to penetrate terrorist organizations with human sources, and you could work very hard to capture their email or their telephone conversations with signals intelligence capabilities. And if you did those things successfully, you had a pretty rich picture of the terrorism threat that you were facing and could then hand that over to the kind of the pointy end of the spear to carry out the kind of effective counterterrorism operations that have kept us safe for most of the time since 9/11. Now the picture is different and harder. All of that work that needs to go on in the human SIGINT domains must continue to go on. We still have to work every day to try to penetrate ISIS, to get inside the decision-making structure of an ISIS leadership in Iraq and Syria. But at the same time, we're also dealing with a tremendously a situation in which we are awash in publicly available information that may have intelligence value when it comes to terrorism. And so how do you figure out what is signal and what is noise in that environment? And it also has implications for how you recruit and train analysts as well. It used to be that you could probably go to schools like this and find talented people who have regional studies, area studies, linguistic studies backgrounds, who understand social science, who understand regional conflict around the world. And you could train them in the intelligence skills they need to be good intelligence analysts. We still need to do all of that, but we also now, and you heard Director Coates refer to this, we need data scientists too. We need that data scientist who will sit next to that person who understands the geopolitical dynamics in South Asia so that he or she can work together to try to piece together the puzzle. And so one of the things I said in public speeches a lot as I was leaving government was I felt like the discipline of intelligence analysis was shifting under our feet literally all the time, and even more so in the last few years. And so as the D&I sits above it all and figures out how do you recruit, train, and resource a system across 16 agencies, he and his colleagues at the D&I have to be mindful of that. It's not just enough to go get the best Russia experts that we can find in grad school, or Iran experts, or North Korea experts. There's a whole lot of other disciplines we need out there. People who probably didn't even imagine a career in the intelligence community or in national security before.
Yeah. Norm, when you're making IC judgments on Iran and other Middle East actors, where did you find yourself looking for the most important information?
Well, first, as the National Intelligence Manager, I did not make judgments upon it. I say that with the former head of the NIC here, so he doesn't throw a cup at me.
Sorry, Greg. Sorry about that.
At least I didn't make them in front of the NIC. Can put it that way. So when I think when you collect information on a hard target, Iran or anything else, you have really two issues. The first is there's a stream of data from a variety of sources: SIGINT, HUMINT, OSINT, MASINT, et cetera, GeoINT, et cetera, et cetera. To me, when we needed to come up with a what does this mean? The role of the ODNI, which is unique because it's not something that the CIA, again, I'm a CIA officer, would innately do or inherently do as a first step, is to identify who that best expert in the U.S. government may be on this issue. And often that was the NIC. And the national intelligence officers are national treasures. But at the same time, it's often a CIA analyst, an NCTC analyst, a CIA collector, an NSA collector. and they would be the individual. DIA has some extraordinary capacity, or CENTCOM. And your ability to be able to say, I've got this, where do I go to get the answer that I can put into a briefing point that may augment a PDB that is going forward in a half an hour, was something that we did routinely in the ODNI. But I think had I been in any one agency, I just would have looked within that agency, and I think you get a broader complexion of data at the ODNI. And of course, the NIC is always doing its magic.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Because,
Okay.
There are, because basically, Michele, what you're talking about here is sources.
Sure.
And how do we know what we know? And maybe speaking to students here, I would say it's time for the exercise of real imagination as we go forward in the future. Now, why do I say that? Well, among our collection methods, there's at least one that is eternal and always will be, and that's HUMINT. Back to biblical times and back further, we will always have and need HUMINT. Nothing beats street knowledge about what's going on in a country, and that's eternal. And that's all there was. If you think about it, let's think about it in a large sweep of time here. Until the mid-19th century, with the invention of the telegraph, that's all there was. But once we started to move information electronically, then the intelligence challenge changed, and we get into the era of SIGINT. And then in the late 1950s, someone says, what if we could take photographs from space? Well, that was a big question then. Now it's nothing. It's on your phone again. So, it's still important, but it's prosaic. One of the issues in the intelligence world now, when you talk to the STEM people, the science and technology people, is the question of phenomenology. Big word, but what it means is, are we extracting all of the data that exists in our technical collection, whether it's radar or infrared imagery from space or whatever? That's one question. The other question is that all there is? Our collection methods are basically from the industrial age and now somewhat post-industrial age as we get into cyber. But is that all there is? When they were asking about imagery in the 50s, that was what we call the paradigm shift question, which means, what is there that if we could do it would revolutionize what we do? And that did revolutionize what we do, imagery. It really did. So that's the question we need to be asking in the intelligence field now, primarily among our science and technology people. What is it that if we could do it would revolutionize what we do? Is that all there is? SIGINT, imagery, MASINT, and HUMINT? Is that the end of the story? Is that the end of history in intelligence? I don't think so. But I'm not smart enough to tell you what the next breakthrough will be in intelligence collection, but there will be one. So all of the students, you guys figure that out.
Thank you very much. And that, I think, Steve, I will turn the reins back over to you. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Don't forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org. We're just about to come out with our third issue. Thanks for listening, and please do rank us on iTunes. It makes a difference.